Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Chitheads. My guest today is Dr. David Vago. David is a research director of the Osher Center for Integrative Medicine at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. He is an associate professor in the Department of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation and Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. He also maintains an appointment as a research associate in the Functional Neuroimaging Laboratory, Brigham and Women's Hospital, Harvard Medical School. He has completed postdoctoral fellowships in the Department of Psychiatry at BWH, the Utah Center for Mind-Body Interactions within the University of Utah Medical School, and the Stuart T. Hauser Research Training Program in Biological and Social Psychiatry. David has previously held the position of Senior Research Coordinator for the Mind and Life Institute and is currently a Mind and Life Fellow, supporting the Mind and Life mission by advising on strategy and programs. He received his bachelor's degree in Brain and Cognitive Sciences in 1997 from the University of Rochester. In 2005, David received his PhD in Cognitive and Neurosciences with a specialization in learning and memory from the Department of Psychology at the University of Utah. David's research interests broadly focus on utilizing translational models to identify and characterize neurobiological substrates mediating psychopathology to better predict outcomes and potential biologically based diagnostic and therapeutic strategies for those suffering with mental illness. He aims to clarify adaptive mind-brain-body interactions and their therapeutic relevance in psychiatric settings. In this context, David has been specifically focusing on the study of mindfulness-based interventions in clinical settings and the basic cognitive and neuroscientific mechanisms by which mindfulness-based practices function. He has published numerous peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, spoken at international conferences, and his research has been covered by mainstream news outlets such as Huffington Post, Boston Globe, and NPR, among others. David is an avid Vipassana, Dzogchen meditation and Hatha yoga practitioner and enjoys recreating in the outdoors. So hello, David. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Yes. I love that part of the bio because when people read it, it's like, yes, and he's currently seeking friends if you'd like to recreate with him in the outdoors as well.
He enjoys long walks recreating in the outdoors. Well, am I pronouncing that correctly? Because I actually, when I first read this, I thought recreating. I don't think I've ever seen recreating used in that kind of a way.
Yeah, I like using it in that context, and that's how I pronounce it too, recreating.
So what kind of recreating do you get up to in the outdoors?
Well, I spent 8 years in Utah, and I think my spirit, my soul just resides in the mountains. Some people are sort of drawn to certain contexts, whether it's an urban environment or the ocean.
Yeah.
I'm just a mountain guy, I think, by nature, and so as much as I can, I'll find myself, traveling to Colorado or Utah or British Columbia and spending as much time there as possible.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate the mountains as well. I'm from Washington State myself, so I grew up around the mountains. Yeah.
Nice.
Beautiful. So before we get into, the fascinating work that you do in contemplative neuroscience, I'd love to hear just a little bit about your own personal story and what has led you to this work that you do.
Sure. Well, I usually tie it back to my first experience in a 10-day Vipassana meditation retreat. Back when I was like 20 years old, I was a junior in college. I was taking some religion courses. I started getting very interested. I was always interested in the mind, and in undergrad, I was both a cognitive neuroscience or biopsychology major, and I was taking a lot of religion classes, and I was trying to find a way to integrate both of them together as a science of mind. And I came across an opportunity to do this Goenka-style retreat. In fact, my uncle, who's a psychiatrist, was also doing these types of practices, and he suggested if you really want to get a real sense of meditation, you should do one of these because it's the real deal. And it certainly was. 10 days, silent retreat. Men and women are separated. You're not speaking. You don't have any distractions. You can't even write. You can only speak if you have questions in the evening. And as a 20-year-old, that was profound for me, and it's probably profound for anybody who does that because it really forces you to look inward. And I did, and I saw the profound effects for me personally. just developmentally, and continue to practice Vipassana style meditation. But there was no real science of meditation that was accepted in mainstream neuroscience. And when I was in graduate school between 99 and 2005, there was still a very scant amount of research on the topic. In fact, on mindfulness specifically, there was like 30 odd publications on the topic before I got to graduate school. And my advisor was basically, encouraging me not to even think about it or pursue that line of research.
Yeah, now I remember you saying that actually in the TED Talk that I watched of you, that there were just 30 odd that there were 30 odd papers on the topic. But you don't mean meditation, all forms of meditation, just specifically mindfulness?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And in fact, it was on what I'm referring to papers on mindfulness specifically.
Right.
Meditation. Yeah, there was about another handful, probably another 50 or so, but not that many. So you can certainly draw distinctions between styles of meditation practice and the context from which they come from. There's a whole, ontological context or cultural context from which they originate.
Yeah.
That has been shifted or changed since, either the time of the Buddha or before Buddha, because the Hindus were practicing meditation way before Buddha was.
Yeah.
And so there are styles of practice that focus on concentration that can be sort of, an umbrella style of meditation across different contexts or cultures even. So the Hindus really focused a lot on cultivating samadhi and concentration, and so did Buddha. He used the breath as a focus, where a lot of the Hindus used the mantra.
Yeah.
And in fact, transcendental meditation came from the Hindu style of mantra practice, where you focused on a string of syllables that had their own divine sort of spiritual meaning behind them and relevance to your own path, but also in the beginning, focusing on sort of string of words is a form of concentration to sort of with what they call pratyahara, or sensory withdrawal. It allows you to draw all your attention away from all the other senses that are the barrage of information that's coming at you, and focus on one thing. So whether it's a mantra or your breath, it's just a different object of focus, but it's still focused concentration. Mindfulness has its own origins, mostly in the Buddhist context, but the new wave of interest in the last decade on mindfulness really comes back to more Buddhist origins than Hindu, or any other contemplative practice, really. So that's why I've been focusing a lot on mindfulness, but I don't exclude all the other contemplative wisdom-based traditions. I'm certainly interested in anything that can lead to human flourishing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So when you're speaking about mindfulness, and I know I've talked a little bit about this with Miles Neal in a previous episode, because he really takes issue with this distinction between like the rigorous idea of mindfulness and kind of this sort of Mick mindfulness that he describes, being sort of a be mindful, blah, 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 this kind of very folk way of thinking about it. So to get very specific, do you want to just describe, what mindfulness is in terms of your research?
Yeah, sure. So I contextualize it very, very specifically, mindfulness as a method or process, because there is a lot of debate over operationalizing mindfulness, so either in schools of Buddhism or in contemporary Western psychological settings. Mm-hmm. Nobody has the authoritative sort of ability to say that I'm going to tell you what mindfulness is and nobody else is right.
Yeah.
In fact, it's used in many different contexts, and I think that's the important point, is that if you're going to use the word, you need to just contextualize it how you're using it. So even somebody who says, I do make mindfulness, call it what you want, in the context of therapy, I'm not a practitioner, but we do mindfulness, what we would call mindfulness inductions. And mindfulness inductions would be a state of mindfulness, a state of being present, focused, non-judgmental, and non-reactive, open, curious, accepting. And you can do that for, 1 moment to 10 minutes. And call that mindfulness, that you did mindfulness. And many Buddhist scholars may refer to that as the mindfulness movement, because it's not, more of a deeper, intense practice that's more continuous. And that's where I draw the distinction between this sort of mindful sort of state of awareness and a path to reduce suffering. Because when I refer to it as a method or a process, it's a path. It's a method a systematic method of mental training for reducing suffering and improving human flourishing, improving the human condition. That's a huge life shift, and I think I try to incorporate both the contemporary aspects of the mindfulness, usage, and the Buddhist model into one sort of coherent package. And this package we refer to as the method that affects multiple systems. And we sort of believe that mindfulness is not just one thing. It's when you do this whole systematic form of training, you're affecting multiple systems across the mind, the brain, and the body. And what my colleague David Silberswag and I did was we created a model that accounted for all of these systems and underlying mechanisms by which these practices that are involved may be working to fundamentally improve the human condition and lead to decreased suffering and flourishing. And we refer to this model as our SART model, or self-awareness, self-regulation, and self-transcendence model, sort of implying that what we're not trying to do is define mindfulness per se, but show how this systematic form of mental training can affect the self. And it does so by increasing self-awareness, increasing our awareness of our own mental habits, moment to moment, increasing our ability to effectively manage our impulses and responses. That's the self-regulation piece. And then self-transcendence, which is much more, and this is also used in many different ways, but we contextualize self-transcendence as the development of a positive relationship between self and other that transcends the self-focused needs and increases more pro-social types of behavior like empathy. Mm-hmm. So that's how we see mindfulness, as sort of this process as a form of systematic mental training to improve self-awareness, self-regulation, self-transcendence.
Great. Interesting. That's very specific and awesome. So to go back a little bit, because we sort of left off in your story a little bit about so you had this experience with Vipassana, and it was, obviously very transformational for you and set you on this path. But what led you specifically into, because there could have been a whole variety of different ways you studied this or practiced this. So what led you to the contemplative neuroscience aspect of this?
I love this question, because every time I try to answer it, I really don't have a good answer for it, because Joseph Campbell says, follow your bliss, right? And that's all I can do is say, you follow always these little subtle signposts, mm-hmm. Along your life path. And you choose what gives you most meaning, what gives you most purpose, what most joy. And as you do that, your sort of meaning and purpose sort of becomes more prominent, and you move closer, or you sort of move into more sort of the micro levels of that path. Yeah. And that's really what's happened to me, just through time. Contemplative neuroscience was emerging as a field while I was also gaining my PhD in cognitive neuroscience and continuing to practice meditation. And then I just had a few I think, chance opportunities to get more involved in the field that was developing. I do owe a lot of gratitude to the Mind and Life Institute, which is a non-for-profit that was started by the Dalai Lama, Francisco Varela, who's a neuroscientist, and Adam Engel, who's a businessman trained at a Harvard Business School. And those guys really, and I sort of pin it on, I blame the Dalai Lama because...
Yeah, I remember this part of your TED Talk as well. Yeah, it seemed like he was very motivational and almost...
Very motivational to me, but to this field, really, he was interested in science.
Yeah.
And without his interest in science, I don't think this field would have gotten so much traction. And because of his interest and because of his prominence in the world, people started to pay attention to these dialogues that were being created by the Mind and Life Institute, Eastern and Western perspectives on mind. What is mind? It's one of the greatest questions in science today. If we try to understand consciousness, we need to understand mind. And, neuroscience has its own very young, immature model of what the mind is and how we can help people who are suffering and improve flourishing. We don't have all the answers in modern day science. But Buddhism has 3,000 years of introspection and sort of inner science that have focused in a very rigorous way into trying to understand the mind by self-observation. So putting those together is been, I think, what I refer to as the inner revolution of science. We're really getting a better idea of what the mind is and what it does, and how using sort of a contemporary neuroscientific lens we can better investigate the mind and incorporate some of these Buddhist principles.
So when you say a neuroscientific account of the mind, I want to ask what exactly you mean by that, because when I think about the mind, I think about and this is my sort of own kind of philosophical objection to not specifically what you're doing, but what some accounts of the mind where they try to reduce kind of the qualities of the mind or the experiences of the mind to brain states, and my kind of immediate objection is just that the experience of love or the experience of reading poetry is not the same as the neuroscientific accounts of what's taking place in my brain. So what do you mean by a neuroscientific account of the mind, and is there a problematic kind of connection there?
There is a problematic connection, and as a sort of an explanatory gap between one's subjective experience, that how one feels, when they're experiencing great pleasures or joys or sorrows, composing a symphony, just enjoying a sunset, the color of vivid blue, all those sort of personal inner experiences. How do we explain that phenomena in a reductionistic sense? There is this big gap, and they call it the hard problem in philosophy and the philosophy of mind for a reason, because it is difficult to see a one-to-one relationship. In fact, if you were to take every neuron and replace it with some sort of, silicon chip, just theoretically, if you could do that, and you replace the entire brain, all 86 billion neurons with all the connections, and you were able to do that, would that physical machine have the same experience as you? And would it be you? And that gap, because most people would say no, absolutely not. That takes away that human factor, that sort of element of spirit that sort of fills the human mind body, is not there. At least that's the argument. And we're not anywhere near that. We can't replace neurons with chips. Maybe we've been able to implant circuits maybe into the brain and have it interact, but there's no way to physically reproduce someone's subjective experience, at least not yet. And there's arguments on both sides suggesting that you can do that, it would happen. And in fact, there's whole groups of people who are thinking that once artificial intelligence emerges significantly enough, that there will be this massive revolution of machines against
there have
humans.
been many movies that start with that premise.
Exactly. I mean, I think it's kind of a fear, right?
Yeah.
But, from my perspective, mind is a powerful tool, and there is no permanent self, and this is the basic premise of all Buddhism. And I think if we can sort of evolve as humans to sort of accept that finally, we can move a little bit beyond just this physical body and start to believe a little bit more into the capacity of the mind to provide what we need in this world, in this reality, in this lifetime, to help reduce the suffering and just enjoy the fruits of being in this world, in this reality. And that, I think, is step number one.
Yeah.
And by focusing on how the mind and the neurobiology that's supporting mind and mental processing, we can investigate how we can use the interactions in a way to map out sort of a method for not only getting feedback from what's going on in our body. I'm wearing a Fitbit today. I got it probably, and I never wear a watch like last time I wore a watch was probably when I was 13. I'm getting used to that. But what's interesting is that it provides data.
Yeah.
It provides data about your body.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as we emerge technologically, we're going to have much more insight into what's going on in our body and our brain at any moment. And having that feedback, we can work more effectively with our body and start to have a healthier mind-body connection at all times. And so if you get angry, the worst thing that can happen is to stay angry all day, and I talked about that in my TED Talk as well. And the fact being that your thoughts, what you put into your mind, has a direct influence on the health of your body. So if you're always having negative thoughts, or you're just angry all the time, your heart rate's going to go up, your blood pressure's going to go up, you're not going to be as efficient at pumping blood, and that's going to lead to cardiovascular disease, increased stress, and that's going to also lead to depression, anxiety, all these bad things. But if you take care of your mind and body, and you're always aware of what's happening, then you're going to have this, theoretically speaking, you're going to have a lot better control over how things emerge and how your body flourishes. I think that's, where the science of mind and contemplative neuroscience sort of fit into helping produce a map into what's happening in mind and brain together in unity, and using that map in a way to scaffold or support the advancement of technology for feedback, and then we can use it for diagnostic purposes, for therapeutic purposes. So there's the mind-brain metaphor of a two-sided coin.
Yeah.
In many cases, what we're really talking about is two sides of the same coin. The brain and the mind are really working always together, and it's really hard to dissociate them.
Mm-hmm. Of course. Yeah, I mean, it's very exciting, the work that you're doing, and one of the beautiful things about it is that, it's putting out, the research that you're putting out is kind of beginning to receive enough attention that it's kind of pushing back against this logic of, okay, I have these mental afflictions, and the cultural logic is to, prescribe myself a medication or to get prescribed a medication, and then,
right,
that's it, and take a pill. And then here, the work that you're doing is really empowering people to realize that they have, the resources within themselves through particular practices to alleviate that suffering. And at the end of the day, it's so much cheaper. Yeah,
exactly. It's so much cheaper. It's so, and it's not a simple thing. I mean, the one thing that I think is often misunderstood is meditation seems like a simple form of relaxation.
Yeah.
That anybody can do and no problem, and all of our problems will be gone, whisked away.
Well, it requires discipline, right? I mean, it's a disciplined process.
And anybody who's tried it knows very clearly by sitting with your eyes closed for an extended period of time is very difficult, not only to just maintain attentional stability, but all the different thoughts that come up, and that's the key, is what thoughts are populating your mind, because we know now that every thought that you have, every emotion that comes up is influencing how the next thought will emerge and how that influences your body, mind, and how it develops together. And disease, we just know that. I mean, there's this great quote by it's in what's the Dhammapada? You know the Dhammapada, and I also shared this as well. But our life is shaped by our mind, for we become what we think. This is these are one of the best collections of teachings by the Buddha, and if our life is actually shaped by our mind and we're becoming what we think, I mean, that's a profound statement. That means that every single want and fear and expectation that we have every moment is influencing the development of ourself.
Yeah.
And, if we want to develop ourself in a healthy way and our relationship to the world, then we have to take care. Yeah. And it takes effort to stabilize our mind from not letting it fly off into negative types of thoughts and feelings and emotions and expectations and jealousy and greed and all those destructive types of emotion.
What is your response to, because what I hear you saying, kind of pushing back against what is another sort of prevailing mythology that I feel like there is in our culture, that, what we are afflicted by is genetically determined, and it's sort of this weird deterministic thing, and I'm thinking of a specific person who I don't want to mention specifically, but, this person had a heart attack, and there's a whole kind of, I could make a whole, have a whole list of kind of things that I could have seen that might have contributed to that in terms of lifestyle and I mean, and anyway, so what, right. But then the response to that is that, oh, well, this is in my family, and everybody's like, in your family, you're going to probably have this or that or blah, 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 the other thing. And so that, to me, that mindset, and of course, there is a role for genetics to play, but what is the role, given also the fact that mindset kind of, it disempowers the incentive to look at the conditions of one's life and the choices that one's making in terms of diet and activity and mindset. What do you? It's because to me it seems like very damaging, this like myth of genetic determinism. Like, what are your thoughts on that? Yeah,
no, it's a really important point, because there are individual differences. I mean, that's the key here. And individual differences means we all are born with different predispositions, and certain life paths are already sort of predetermined in some way.
I can't change my hair color or my eyes. I mean, that's given. Yeah. Right.
Exactly. And in the same way, there are some factors in your physiology that are going to determine risk factors for certain diseases. You saw Gattaca. That's pretty accurate. You sort of get categorized if we had a complete map of our genome, and, we're getting actually better and better at doing this. We can look at the different genetic predispositions towards certain diseases. Some of them are mapped better than others, like, for example, Huntington's disease. You can know early on that you have the gene for developing Huntington's disease, but, it doesn't present itself until late 30s, early 40s. And so you can be living your whole life without experiencing that. And then, you have to have certain genetic counseling to know if you're mentally stable to handle that information. Right. And then by the time you're 35, 40, you're going to get this horrible wasting disease that's going to affect your mind and body. So just like there are different dispositional factors for development of mind through meditation practice. So different people come to the cushion at different levels of conscious awareness. Some may progress faster in terms of gaining more sort of insight into their own mental habits, and some may progress much slower. In fact, Alan Wallace, in this context, Alan Wallace is a Buddhist scholar. He said there are three types of people. One is the person who practices meditation, a few times, goes to maybe a Dharma talk or two, and suddenly a profound shift happens, and they just get it, and they feel enlightened. And that's a very rare group of people. Maybe 0.0005% of the people experience that. And there's another group of people who practice for years and years and years on the cushion and diligently. And eventually, piece by piece, they start to put things together and experience, some awakening, some sort of enlightened sort of states that we can try to understand, but lead to improved the human condition. And finally, there's the last type of people, which is probably the most common, which takes lifetimes to basically achieve any sort of benefit.
Womp
womp. Right? That's like the majority of us. Yeah. But so the point here, though, related to genetics is that we all come from different backgrounds, and we're all going to have different dispositions. And some of us, it'll be easier to maintain a healthy lifestyle and achieve benefit from sitting practice, and others it may never come. And some people sit on a cushion for 30 years and are still assholes.
Yeah.
Why is that? And I think with science, unfortunately, and I feel that way all the time. Every time we come out of yoga class, I'm like, we just did a whole hour and a half of yoga, and you're still like,
I'm still pissed.
Yeah. But science is always focused on what we call the bell curve. I've used the bell curve of averages. We're lumpers. We like to take people, hundreds of people, put them into a study. We look at the average, brain activity in over repeated 5-minute blocks. And we say, well, over this 100 people and over 30 repeated 5-minute blocks, brain activity that we see that averages across all those people in comparison to some baseline arbitrary state is this pattern. And fortunately, that's provided a lot of insight into how the brain works, and may provide some insight into behavior. But what we realized only recently is that that has no effect on individualized medicine, and that there are so many individual differences in where people are genetically and in terms of what their sort of nature has sort of sculpted for them. Because if you have trauma in your life, it's going to dramatically shift, those genetics in a negative downward spiral. Meditation is going to help unravel it. But if you have those factors like genetic markers for cardiovascular disease or other neurodegenerative problems or behavioral experiences of trauma, that's going to be an uphill battle for you. And so by taking into account these individual differences, that's where science is going to help us better understand what practices are going to work for which people.
Right.
And we're going to see which genomic markers we can actually shift towards a more positive trajectory. And that is real science too. This is called epigenetics. Basically, these heritable traits that you have as genetic markers can change. They change in a positive way, but they take a lot more effort, and it's going to take a lot more sort of pressure for those genomic markers to shift.
Can you give an example of a genomic marker that you've found shifts through these practices?
Yeah, so people are starting to look at this, and there's not a lot of good data, at least from the meditation science, showing that meditation can shift these markers. But, for example, people with cardiovascular disease, I think this is a good indication. People with cardiovascular markers for cardiovascular disease. There are some markers now, for example, in inflammatory markers. The more inflammation you have in your body and brain, the more likely you are at risk to have a risk for developing cardiovascular disease in some form or another. So you could either die of a heart attack due to just more constriction of your blood vessels, or you may have atherosclerosis, where you have buildup of plaque, cholesterol, and lipids into your portal system, veins and arteries. And so what we've seen is there have been some studies suggesting that if you do a lot of these positive behaviors like exercise or meditation and yoga, that those epigenetic markers associated with inflammation can be reduced. So that does exist, and that would be a form of epigenetic change or phenomena, that a biological trait or a genetic marker with a disposition towards disease is shifted through some positive behavior. And we're just learning what those genomic markers are more and more. But inflammation is a really good example because we have a pretty solid handle there and its connections with cardiovascular disease.
Excellent. That's so interesting. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about, I want to ask for maybe some specific examples or I guess I'll ask it this way. What are some of the most profound insights that the scientific research that you're doing has unveiled about? I know you've done some work on yoga as well, but mindfulness, meditation, contemplative neuroscience, the work that you're doing. What are some of the insights that the audience might be fascinated to hear?
Yeah, so remember I started by saying that there weren't a lot of studies on mindfulness in the year 2000, right? So since then, in the last 15 years or so, there's been, I think, close to 4,000 studies. And so that's a lot of increases in the amount of research that's being done on mindfulness. However, there's big caveats there. Of all those studies that are claiming all these benefits, if you really look most rigorously at all the studies and try to get a better sense of what's really changing using the most rigorous standards, the data isn't that impressive. In fact, unfortunately. There are some real promising findings. For example, of the 47,000 studies that are out there looking at active controls for interventions on clinical symptoms, there's I think I think there's 18. Let's see if I can find exactly how many. But there's 47, for example, studies, I think, total, that using the most rigorous standards. There was a meta-analysis done by Goyal et al., who found that of all the studies that are out there, if you took an 8-week mindfulness-based intervention, which is the standard now, a standard model for delivering mindfulness training, which is 26 hours, once a week, 2 hours of class, in-class guided practice, 45 minutes of homework a day, meaning lots of home practice, an all-day retreat. If you did that for 8 weeks and then compared all the studies that were done using that model versus an active control, which is meaning using the most rigorous standards, we say we want to compare this to another group who met to control for all these non-specific factors of the benefits of being in a social support group and paying attention to certain information, and comparing those two types of models together. What you find is that symptoms of depression and anxiety and aspects of the emotional aspects of pain are improving more significantly than the active control. So that's promising. Although these comparisons also show that sleep, addiction, well-being, a lot of positive factors are not actually improving any better, but symptoms, depression, anxiety, and emotional aspects of pain are improving more significantly. So that's promising. That's from the clinical angle. From the neurobiological angle, we're able to look at, all the 80 different studies. I think, if you look at of those 4,000 studies that I said have existed in the last 15 years, there's been 21 neuroimaging studies looking at brain structure and 80 looking at brain function. And of those ones looking at the brain, we can say that there are some consistent changes in the brain that are suggestive of what is transforming in these practitioners, because we have ideas of what these brain regions and networks are responsible for in terms of behavior. So I think, I've mentioned that you can reduce it down to 4 different brain regions to really get a sense of, essence of what's changing in the brain. And I can say, for the sake of just not repeating myself, but being very clear that there are attentional networks, for example, that are active when we meditate. We see it when people are put into a brain scanner, an MRI machine. While they're meditating, we know there's very specific networks that are responsible for stable attention and for one of the most critical aspects of meditation practice, and one of the only aspects of cognition that seems to be changing significantly is meta-awareness. This is awareness of awareness. This is what is so critical to practice. Yeah. It's insight into where our mind is at any moment in time. There's one really major node of this network, which is right behind your forehead, called the frontal polar cortex. And that works.
Interesting. Is that sort of generally related to the region of the third eye? I mean,
yes. In fact, it is with the chakras. It is
interesting.
So yes, the Hindus may have been right in the general area of the chakra of the third eye and what area is really responsible. In fact, between 2 and 3 million years ago, our earliest hominid ancestors, when they started to roam the savannah on 2 legs, start to use tools, fire, language developed, something shifted, whether it was aliens that came down from outer space and sort of injected us with some knowledge, or whether it was just...
do you think that happened?
I leave it open.
You think it's a valid? I want to ask you this because I recently heard someone talking about this. Like, do you think it's a valid? I don't want to totally get sidetracked here, but
I don't see why not. I mean, if there's evidence for it, something shifted in our earliest hominid ancestors between 2 and 3 million years ago. So much so that our cranial capacity grew exponentially and separated us from our bonobos. Our bonobos are the closest ancestors to us, for example, in terms of and from if you look at the craniums of the Australopithecus, which is the earliest hominid ancestors to us, and which represented human-like people, hominids who were walking upright, who were using tools, who were doing sort of ritualistic stuff. Seemed like they had language. They were putting paintings on walls. They were foraging. They had to memorize where their food locations were. There was a huge influx of cognitive functioning that needed to happen for those types of behaviors to occur. So if it was some spontaneous evolution from, I don't know, eating some strange mushroom in the ground, or what, or
magic mushrooms.
Yes, exactly.
We just needed some psychedelics to evolve,
Hey, Terence McKenna said that that's essentially how we developed our mind, is through our communication through or experimenting with different fungi that grew in the earth that expanded our mind potential. It's very possible. There's some theories that will suggest that. I don't think the evidence is clear from that historical point of view. But what is clear is that this part of our brain is the part that evolved the most. Yeah. And it separates us dramatically from our other hominid ancestors.
Yeah.
In fact, there's like huge amounts of space in our frontal lobes specifically dedicated to creating connections with the rest of our brain. And those connections really allow us to make the connections that are necessary for planning, what we call executive functioning. So planning, meta awareness, keeping something in mind, a task in mind while doing something else. It's unfortunately what helps us multitask, and at the same time becomes a problem in our contemporary society because we're constantly seeking stimulation, and so we're rapidly switching between things, our phone, our Facebook, our social media, what's going on around us. And our frontal lobes, or especially the frontal polar cortex, is really important for supporting that function. But it's not always to our advantage to be constantly switching.
Yeah.
What mindfulness is doing more than anything else, and what the evidence seems to be showing, both from cognitive point of view and from the biological point of view, is this part of our brain is growing in size and it's increasing in function while we meditate. And that's really important for allowing us to flexibly switch between types of processing, our behaviors, types of thinking. And that's critical, because if you have insight and awareness, this awareness of what your mind is doing at any moment, then you can at least say, is this an appropriate time to be on my phone or not? While you're driving, maybe not. While in conversation with somebody else, probably not. And to have the impulse control, to put it down, to have our conversations, to be present, that requires effort and practice. So I think it's a skill that all of us are developing as humans. But to be able to have the insight and the impulse control, to be able to know when to allow that great capacity of our frontal polar cortex to continually switch, is something that develops through meditation practice. So I would say that part of our brain and the networks that are associated with this part, which is a frontal parietal network of attention. So parts of our parietal lobe help us also work together as a network. And those are the brain regions that are working together. So frontal polar cortex, parts of parietal lobe, what we call the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, which, there we go, it's a little, got a brain here.
So explain it, since people who are listening to the podcast can't see this brain. So explain it. Yeah.
Oh, they can't see the brain. Okay. So, right. So people who are not seeing this, what I'm trying to show is that there's a part of your brain, the frontal polar cortex, right behind your forehead, communicates with our parietal lobe, which is basically above our ear. If you just go a little bit higher than our ear, it's in general sort of not the back of our head, but at the sort of top side of our head. That's a parietal lobe. Mm-hmm. And then if you were to peel off your cortex from your brain stem, right, the last layer of cortex that separates your cortex from your brain stem is called the cingulate gyrus. It's just a strip of gray matter, which are just neurons that help communicate information coming from your brainstem. So really important autonomic functions like respiration, arousal, but also early forms of sensory processing, where your attention should shift, and communicating that to the rest of your brain. It's all also modulated by that cingulate gyrus. And that cingulate gyrus in the frontal part of it, it's called the anterior cingulate gyrus. That is in the frontal portion of it. It works together with your frontal polar cortex, your parietal lobe, and one other brain region I'll just throw out there called the insula. And I'm just going to, so those of you who can see, it is located, basically there's a fold in your brain. And that's called the sylvian fissure or lateral fissure. That's here. And if you were to just pry that open and look inside, you would see a fold of tissue. Where is it? There it is. It's a fold of tissue right there. That fold of tissue is called your insula, or insular cortex. That your whole body's mapped in there, and in fact, parts of the anterior or more frontal portions of that brain region, your insula, may be very unique to humans, and it is really important for body awareness of what's happening internally, not just in the body itself physically, but just viscerally, sort of intuitively, what's going on inside you and around you. So together, the insula, anterior cingulate cortex, and the frontal polar cortex and the parietal lobes work together to provide that meta-awareness skill very efficiently, and to then facilitate that self-regulation part, which is the impulse control. And in fact, it also contributes to this self-transcendence piece, which is dissolving the distinctions between self and other, improving your ability to put yourself in the shoes of others, to have that empathy, to understand what other people are experiencing as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's what we can infer from the data that we see at this point out of the 80 neuroimaging studies, the 20 the structural ones, the 4,000 studies that have talked about mindfulness in some way. That's really the take home, I think.
Mm. In your research, have there been any sort of classic, experience, like classical mystical experiences? And I'm thinking, you're talking about self-transcendence here, and so I'm thinking sort of a form of self-transcendence which would, dissolve the experience of self so much that someone has an experience of kind of oneness with, whatever, the cosmos. Is that also in, if you have seen that in your research, is that also associated with this region of the brain you're talking about?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question, and we are trying to put that experience on the map as well. Neuroscience, I think, has also been very hesitant to talk about this concept of enlightenment, for example, and markers of enlightenment or self-transcendence. Mm-hmm. And I would say there are clear subjective markers for what the Buddhists or the Hindus may refer to as awakening, markers of progress, of insight. The Dzogchen, the Tibetan Buddhist community, would call Rigpa, or the Theravadins would say stream entry. Dipping your sort of awareness into the stream of consciousness that sort of fills all humanity, all universe, all the cosmos. This greater awareness that may connect us all. Now, this is hard to empirically demonstrate.
Yeah. Is that the resistance to it, or is it also the fact that gets you into the territory of, religious ideas that scientists are sort of, wary to discuss?
It's a little bit of both. Yeah. Absolutely. But, I think if you can operationalize these markers and reproducibly have them experienced by practitioners across contexts and capture what it looks like, then that's evidence. Yeah. And so that's what we're striving to do. And so we've created actually a paper with David Yadin and Jonathan Haidt that just came out in a review of General Psychology that operationalizes this experience of self-transcendence. And in fact, there is this dissolution of self, this sort of nihilistic component of self-dissolving that we try to operationalize, and then this sense of unity, like you mentioned, feeling one with everything. And that's a subjective state that a lot of people report having, either through some drug-induced state or through meditation or contemplative experience across different religious contexts. Doesn't matter if it's Judeo-Christian, Muslim, or otherwise. Yeah. People who have spiritual experiences, or whether it's lovemaking or whether it's in nature, people report having these types of unity experiences. Yeah. So what does that look like? We don't have a reproducible substrate for that yet. We have some indication that it does involve this frontal parietal network.
Mm-hmm.
There have been some evidence categorizing that experience as what we refer to as non-dual experience. Mm-hmm. Non-dual meaning there's no duality of subject and object.
Right.
Most of our reality is there's subject, ourselves, our experience, and an object, something else out there, not me. Me, not me. But when you have these spiritual experiences, that subject-object distinction dissolves into a non-dual experience. And this is sometimes referred to in Dzogchen, Tibetan Buddhism, as Rigpa. We've set up a few other cultures or contexts have referred to it as Zen is Kensho, or Chitta, Bodhicitta, like just experiencing this sort of element of awakening for a moment. It could be fleeting. In a tradition, one teacher that we were studying is Shinzen Young. Shinzen is a more contemporary Western teacher, but who incorporates elements of Japanese Shingon and Zen together, as well as the Burmese style of noting and labeling practice. And through his methods, he refers to that experience as gone.
You're not here.
Right. So simply you can say, like, here's an object, a little ball, a little yoga ball. And as it arises into your visual consciousness, it arises and it can also pass. Mm. And in Theravadan tradition, this arising and passing is a very traditional way of being able to train your mind to note and label arising and passing of mental objects. And the idea is that the passing and gone, the absence of, is a sort of an analog for larger aspects of all of reality dropping away and being gone. So Shinzen makes a distinction between gone with a little g and gone with a big G. And we had a few people experience this gone state with a big G in the scanner. And so we still have trying to figure out, using different methods to interpret what we found, trying to map the exact time that it happened in comparison to what was happening before. And what we do see is typically just increases in activity in that frontal polar region more than any other marker.
Which is interesting that, in the experiential domain, it might be a kind of sense of, nothingness, or an experience of, like you say, being gone. Others, reported as being more of an activity there. But it's interesting to me that, in the subjective experience, something that might be experienced as a kind of absence or, not being here, in the brain there is this profound activity that you're talking about,
Right. I should say one other thing that's interesting that comes online very strongly for most meditators, and this doesn't depend too much on how much practice you have, but that you have a significant, I should say, if you reach a significant amount of practice, say 1,000 hours, which is, a decent amount of formal practice, you start to engage a part of your subcortical areas called the basal ganglia, specifically a part called the putamen, which is really active during skill-based learning. So when you ride a bike, it's active in trying to train your body and mind to communicate efficiently so you don't have to think about it. It's like being in the zone in a sport or flow states. Yeah. When you're in this sort of flow state, you stop thinking, but your body is doing. You're just doing. And that's why I love Nike for their ability to capture that perfect metaphor for being in the flow, being in the zone. Just do it. Because you're really just doing. You're not thinking. You're not doing anything else but doing. You're being. Yeah. And there's a brain substrate for that. And you see that also active in these more non-dual states as well. But I think it's still early to say definitively that we have pinned down a substrate for this non-dual state. I think it has to be reproducible across conditions and contexts. So we have to get more subjects in the scanner and look at the physiology as well and see what's happening in the periphery too. I want to see what's happening.
Are you always looking for volunteers, or is it sort of more of a controlled process like that?
No, we have one initiative called Mapping the Meditative Mind, which is always looking for volunteers, and we have a pretty large database that we're collecting to bring people down here at Vanderbilt and put them in the scanner. So that's
put them in the scanner.
Yeah.
All right. So this has been a really fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for sharing all this amazing work that you're doing. One of the things that before we close out, I wanted to ask you, from my obviously untrained as a scientist perspective, the work that you're doing looks extremely rigorous and not messing around. But I'm curious if you've encountered any resistance to this kind of research within the wider scientific community. Because of course, we have kind of the kind of orthodox or traditional way of doing science or looking at psychology. So I'm curious, what your thoughts are on that, if you've encountered any kind of, resistance by, I guess I'll call it the orthodoxy, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, there's definitely skeptics, and that's okay. I think having skeptics, it makes the science stronger.
Yeah,
and I value every bit of skepticism, and as long as there's clear, articulate comments about the methods or the results, because what we're trying to do is rigorous science, and over the last decade, the science has just been getting better, but there's a lot of gaps. But there's evidence, that you can't argue with. For example, when someone does a non-referential compassion meditation who is a very advanced meditator, you see a dramatic increase in 40 to 70 hertz brain activity. Electrical activity in your brain dramatically shifts in amplitude and frequency very fast. And you can't argue with that data. It's very clear.
Yeah. And
we're starting to see a lot of different markers like frontal midline theta activity for advanced meditation. It's hard data. It's reproducible. You can't argue with that. And in fact, the NIH had a National Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine. And in 2014, I believe, they changed the name through Barack Obama's initiative to focus on brain science. They changed the name to National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health, NCCIH. That's the new center. That's a huge shift. It's subtle. But what they're saying is that a lot of the practice – so I'm in an integrative medicine clinic. That's where I reside.
Yeah.
That means we practice yoga, meditation, acupuncture, physical therapy, psychotherapy that incorporates mindfulness, all in one clinic. And it's an integrative health approach to disease, dysfunction, and in a prophylactic way for improving well-being.
Yeah.
The reason why it was complementary and alternative before was that there wasn't a strong evidence base for these practices. So they had to say it was complementary to traditional Western approaches or mainstream medicine. What we realize now is that as we create an evidence base to support these practices, and in fact, the American College of Physicians just put out a statement about a few months ago saying that first line approach to dealing with low back pain has to be an integrative one.
Yeah.
Yoga, meditation, acupuncture before opiates. Okay, so
that's sort of the standard way or the traditional way of going about it, is just to prescribe them something.
Exactly, opiates was mainstream.
Oh
and what we're realizing is opiates are not the best way. And bed rest too. And
which is like the opposite of what they need, isn't it? Bed rest.
Right. So these days, it's physical therapy, occupational therapy. Doing some light stretching or under the guidance of a physical therapist, working with the pain a bit more rather than numbing it is much more effective, what we realize.
Yeah.
And doing, light stretching with your body, like yoga and meditation, breathing techniques to not let the emotion tense up around the pain really is much more effective. And that's part of this whole trend of integrative medicine that's happening here. It's just good medicine now. It's just good medicine. So you can't really argue with that.
Yeah.
You can still argue with enlightenment and finding the neural correlates of enlightenment, because that's a little bit harder to put empirical data on. But, we're just using the scientific lens to do that, just like anybody else could. And I think that maintains the rigor of the science. And so, that's the best we can do.
Yeah. Excellent. All right. Well, this has been really interesting, David. Thank you so much. Yeah. So I just want to mention, what's that?
It was a pleasure meeting you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure meeting you. And for those listening, David is actually going to be giving a talk in our upcoming conference, Radical Therapies, which is taking place July 14th through the 16th. Let me see if I have his talk title right here. Pulling it up. Actually, while I find it, David, why don't you tell the audience where they can find out a little bit more about you if anyone who wants to check out your research or look up the institute that you're involved in. I know I mentioned it at the beginning, but if you want to give any more kind of details, website info, that sort of stuff.
Sure. Well, you can find much more detail about our work at contemplativeneurosciences.com. And, from there, we're at the Osher Center for Integrated Medicine. There are now 6 different Osher Centers for Integrated Medicine across the world.
Wow.
One here, one at Harvard, one at Northwestern, one at UCSF, and now some new ones that are emerging, as well as one in the Karolinska Institute in Sweden. And you can find, there's a resource, oshercenter.org, or you can go find the Osher Center information at the medschool.com. And Vanderbilt, you can just look up vanderbilthealth.com/Osher to find information about Osher. But contemplativeneurosciences.com has everything. You can find
contemplativeneurosciences.com. All right, great. And then I found that name of that talk. The talk David is giving at the conference is called Contemplative Neuroscience, Past and Present Perspectives for the Future Science of Mind. So if you want to sign up for that, you can just head to radtherapies.embodiedphilosophy.com. All right. Thanks, David. It's been a pleasure chatting, and I will speak to you soon.
Yes, likewise. Great to meet you. Great to be with you.